She knelt in the dark with her hands buried in slime, and the whole valley agreed Elspeth Gable had finally lost her mind. The air, thick and wet as a shroud, carried the smell of rot and damp earth. A faint luminescence, like spilled moonlight, clung to the ground, a living carpet of it that shifted and pulsed. Slugs, not the few that hid under a cabbage leaf, but a silent, flowing river of them, coating every stalk and stone. They were in the bean rows, a glistening mass that bowed the plants to the ground. They were climbing the walls of her small cabin. She could hear the faint, horrid rasp of their feeding. And here was Elspeth, in the dead of night, not fighting them, not weeping, but running her bare hands through them, her face a mask of concentration. A lantern cast a weak, yellow circle around her, catching the glint of 1,000 slimy backs. From the road, a passing rider had seen the light and the kneeling woman, and by morning the story was all over the settlement of Promise Creek. Mad Elspeth Gable, down on her knees, praying to the slugs that were eating the valley alive. It was a sad thing, they said, what loneliness and hardship could do to a woman alone. It was a judgment. What they did not yet know was that Elspeth was not praying. She was counting. She was doing the arithmetic of her own vindication. 6 months earlier, in the raw days of a late spring, Elspeth had stood in the dusty track that served as the town's main street and committed her folly. Tom was only 4 months in the ground, the stony soil of the churchyard still looking disturbed. He'd left her with 40 acres of indifferent land, a cabin that leaked in 3 places, and a debt to Silas Blackwood at the grain exchange that sat like a stone in her belly. She had a handful of dollars left from the sale of their only cow, money meant to see her through to a kitchen garden harvest. It was this money she held clutched in her pocket as a traveling poultry dealer, his wagon stinking of death and desperation, tried to offload his final, miserable stock. Crate after crate of healthy chicks and ducklings had been sold. What remained was a teeming, peeping mass of goslings in a wide, flat crate. There must have been 100 of them, but they were a disaster. Their legs were splayed, twisted, or simply too weak to hold their small, downy bodies. They stumbled and fell over one another, a chorus of weak, plaintive cries. Splayed leg. The dealer grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her worn boots. Bad hatch. Bad travel. Worthless. I'm taking them to the ditch outside of town. You can have the lot for $5. Cheaper than drowning them myself. The men loafing on the porch of the general store watched, their faces set in the easy pity they reserved for a young widow making poor choices. Silas Blackwood himself, a man whose substance was matched only by his condescension, stepped out. "Now, Elspeth," he said, his voice oozing a false, neighborly concern. "A woman alone can't be taking on charity cases. You need good laying hens. Something that will pay." He looked at the heap of struggling birds. "There's no meat on those, and they'll never stand to breed. You'd have done better to sleep in the street." She felt the truth of his words like a slap. It was a foolish, sentimental thing to do. She should buy flour, salt pork, something sensible. But she looked at the goslings, at the flickering life in their small, dark eyes, and saw not what was, but what might be. She saw the marshy, sour patch of her land down by the creek, the part everyone, including Tom, had called useless. She saw the endless supply of tender reeds and grass shoots. She remembered a phrase from her grandmother. "A goose walks on its stomach, I'll take them," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She counted the $5 into the dealer's grimy hand. The laughter from the porch wasn't loud, but it was clear. A deal was struck. The dealer, glad to be rid of them, helped her load the crate onto her small handcart. As she began the long, slow pull home, she heard Blackwood's voice carry on the breeze. "Well, that's the end of Tom Gable's legacy." Eaten by Elspeth's folly, the name stuck. The journey home was 2 miles. With every jolt of the cart, a fresh wave of miserable peeping rose from the crate. By the time she reached her property, 3 of the goslings were dead. She carried them, limp and still warm, to the base of an old oak and buried them with her bare hands. That left 97. She did the arithmetic in her head. 97 mouths to feed. 97 broken bodies to mend. 1 woman alone. She worked until dusk, fencing in the marshy acre with scrap lumber and salvaged wire. It was ugly, but it was strong. Inside the enclosure, she built a low, rough shelter of pine boughs and canvas. Then, one by one, she lifted the goslings from their crate. She brought them water in a shallow pan, and many drank thirstily, their small necks craning. But few could stand to reach it. As darkness fell, she sat on the damp ground, the chorus of weak cries surrounding her, and felt the first cold spike of despair. The laughter from the town echoed in her ears. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was madness. She pulled her shawl tighter, the smell of dust and sorrow rising from the wool. The wind soughed in the pines, sounding like a long, slow sigh. It was the sound of being utterly and completely alone. She stayed there for a long time, watching the stars prick the deep velvet of the sky, until the cold seeped into her bones and she knew she had two choices: give up and let them die, or get to work. Elspeth rose before the sun, as she always did. The chill of the night still clung to the hollows. She found 2 more goslings had died in the night. 95. The number was a small, hard knot in her chest. She did not allow herself to grieve. Instead, she took a sharp knife and a basket and went into the woods and along the creek bed, gathering what the others ignored. She collected tinderdock leaves, chickweed, and the bright green heads of dandelions. She minced them fine with an old cleaver until she had a fragrant, damp mash. She spread this on flat pieces of bark and placed them among the struggling birds. A few began to peck at it, then more. It was a start. Then came the harder work. She tore an old bedsheet into thin strips. From the willows stand by the creek, she cut dozens of straight, pliant twigs. For the rest of the day, and the day after that, Elspeth performed a strange and patient surgery. She would catch a gosling, hold its trembling body gently in her lap, and examine its legs. For those with splayed legs, she fashioned a soft hobble from the cloth strips, tying their legs into the proper position beneath them, loose enough for movement but tight enough to encourage the muscles to grow correctly. For the twisted, weaker legs, she made tiny splints from the willow twigs, binding them straight. Her hands, already calloused from farm work, grew rougher, pricked by twigs and stained with green from the mash. She worked with a quiet, fierce focus, whispering to each bird as she handled it. "There now, you'll be strong. Just a little help is all." Her nearest neighbor, Mr. Anselm, a stooped old man from the old country who spoke in thick, accented sentences, came to his fence line one afternoon. He watched her for a long time, his pale blue eyes missing nothing. He had seen a lifetime of hardship and knew the look of a desperate gamble. He did not laugh. He simply watched her wrap a tiny leg, her movements economical and sure. "Is a hard work, for a maybe," he said finally, his voice raspy. Elspeth looked up, her face smudged with dirt. "It's the only work I have," she replied. He nodded slowly, chewing on a piece of grass. "In my country," he said, "the old people say, a thing is not worthless because it is weak. It is worthless only if it cannot find its strength." He gestured with his chin toward the goslings. "You give them a place to find it." "Maybe is enough," he said nothing more, just turned and shuffled back toward his own tidy cottage. But his words settled in Elspeth's mind, a small, warm stone of encouragement. She was not just mending bone and sinew. She was providing a place for strength to be found. By the end of the first week, she had splinted or hobbled nearly 80 of the birds. She lost 3 more. 92. The arithmetic was relentless. But the 92 who remained were all eating. Their droppings were healthy. The spark of life in them was beginning to burn a little brighter. She started giving them names. There was a feisty one she called General, a quiet one she called Shadow. A particularly loud one was named Thunder. The town would have howled with laughter if they'd known. A woman naming birds she'd bought for the ditch. But for Elspeth, giving them a name was a way of claiming them, of insisting on their worth. A boy started appearing at her fence line. Finn, the blacksmith's youngest, a scrawny 10-year-old with hair the color of straw and eyes that saw everything. He never said much. He'd just perch on the top rail of the fence and watch her. He watched her change the splints, mix the mash, and clean the shelter. One day, she looked up and he was standing inside the enclosure, holding out a handful of clover he'd picked. "This is good for them," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Elspeth nodded. "It is." "Thank you." Finn, from then on, he was her shadow. He learned to mix the mash just right. He had small, nimble fingers, perfect for retying the cloth hobbles. He never tired of the work. He learned all the names and would talk to the Goslings as he worked, scolding Thunder for trying to peck his buttons, praising a small hen he'd named Pip for finally putting weight on her splinted leg. For the first time since Tom's death, Elspeth felt a flicker of something other than grief or grim determination. It was companionship. The flock was her purpose, but Finn was her audience, a silent, steady believer. Together, they tended Elspeth's folly. The days shortened into a rhythm of work. Dawn was for gathering greens. Morning was for mending legs. Afternoon was for cleaning and fresh water. Evening was for watching, for counting, for worrying. The mockery from the town continued, a low hum of disapproval she had to actively ignore. When she went to the store for flour, the men would ask, "How's the goose hospital, Elspeth? Haven't they died yet?" Silas Blackwood would just shake his head with a theatrical sigh, as if her failure was a personal burden to him. She never answered them. She would meet their jeers with a quiet stillness, pay for her goods, and walk away. Being right, she was learning, was its own kind of reply, but it had to be earned in silence first. By June, a change was undeniable. The ugly, awkward balls of down were transforming. Feathers, sleek and white, began to replace the fluff. The goslings were growing, their bodies filling out, and their legs were straightening. Day by day, Elspeth and Finn removed the splints and hobbles. The first time a gosling stood on its own 2 feet, wobbly but upright, Finn let out a whoop of pure joy. Soon, more were standing, then walking, then running, their necks outstretched, in a clumsy, honking pack. They were still ridiculous. They had been handled so much from birth that they had no fear of Elspeth or Finn. They were tamer than any dog. The flock of 92 birds followed Elspeth everywhere. If she went to the woodpile, a cacophony of geese trailed behind her. If she worked in her garden, they foraged nearby, a moving, honking, white wave. Their comic dignity was a source of constant, gentle humor. General, now a formidable gander, would stand guard while she weeded, hissing at any squirrel that dared come too close. The flock was beautiful, a sea of white against the green of her land. They were also loud. Their honking could be heard a mile away, a constant proclamation of their existence. The town stopped calling them Elspeth's Folly and started calling them Elspeth's Noise. But the laughter was different now. It was less sharp, more bewildered. No one could deny that the birds that were meant for a ditch were not only alive, but thriving. They were magnificent, heavy-bodied creatures, their feathers immaculate, their eyes bright and intelligent. The marshy acre Tom had cursed was now the flock's paradise. They feasted on the lush growth, their droppings enriching the soil. They swam in the creek, their white bodies serene against the dark water. Elspeth watched them, and the arithmetic in her head began to change. It was no longer about survival. It was about possibility. By late July, the first egg appeared. It sat in a nest of reeds, a perfect, enormous oval of creamy white, nearly twice the size of a chicken egg. Elspeth held it in her hands, its weight a solid promise. Soon there were more. A dozen a day, then 2, then 3. She gathered them in a large basket, the pale shells glowing in the lamplight of her cabin. This was it, the first true return on her investment. She took 2 dozen of the finest eggs and walked to the general store. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, peered at them over his spectacles. "Goose eggs," he grunted. "Can't say there's much call for them." Folks like what they know. Silas Blackwood was there, of course, leaning against the counter. "They're too big, Elspeth," he said smoothly. "Gamey taste. I'll give you a penny apiece for them. Use 'em for dog food, a penny." The price was a calculated insult. Humiliation burned in her cheeks. She was about to turn and leave when the bell over the door jingled. A man she'd never seen before entered. He was dressed in clean city clothes, his face flushed from the heat. "Pardon me," he said, his voice crisp. "I'm the new cook from the hotel over at the county seat. Our delivery wagon broke an axle down the road. I need eggs. 2 dozen, if you have them." He spotted her basket. "My word," he breathed, stepping closer. He picked one up, weighing it in his palm. "What beautiful eggs." Mr. Henderson and Blackwood exchanged a look. "They're just goose eggs," Henderson said dismissively. The cook ignored him, his eyes fixed on Elspeth. "Are they fresh, madam?" "Gathered this morning," she said. "The flock forages on clean pasture. I can tell." He turned the egg over. "Look at that shell. Thick. Perfect. I'll take all you have, and I'll pay a fair price. 10 cents an egg. And I'll take this many every week, if you can provide them, $2.40. It was more money than she'd seen at one time in months. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the coins. Silas Blackwood's face was a study in disbelief and irritation. The city cook packed the eggs carefully into a box he'd brought. A goose that forages on good green pasture, he said to no one in particular, lays an egg with a yolk like sunset. You can't fake that quality. He tipped his hat to Elspeth. I'll be back next Tuesday, ma'am. And just like that, he was gone. The silence in the store was thick. Elspeth met Blackwood's narrowed gaze. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply gathered her basket, nodded to Mr. Henderson, and walked out, the weight of the coins in her pocket a solid, satisfying affirmation. She had been right. It was a small victory, a private one, but it tasted sweeter than any revenge. She kept it to herself, a coal banked low under ash, knowing its warmth was for her alone. From that day on, every Tuesday, she met the hotel cook on the road. The income was steady, enough to pay down a little of her debt to Blackwood, which seemed to gall him more than anything else. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The heat was relentless, but it was a wet, suffocating heat. The sky was a permanent, hazy gray, promising rain that never came, a lid clamped tight on the valley. The air was so thick you could feel it on your skin. It was weather that bred sickness in the soil. And then, the rumors started. A patch of ruined cabbages at the Miller farm. Strange, silvery trails in the dirt. Then whole rows of beans at the Petersons, gone overnight, chewed down to ragged stumps. At first, no one knew what it was. They blamed cutworms, deer, raccoons. But the devastation spread with unnatural speed. One night a field of young corn would be fine. The next morning it would look as if a ragged scythe had been taken to the stalks. Elspeth's small kitchen garden, tucked behind her cabin, remained untouched. She was so consumed with the geese that she barely noticed, other than to feel a quiet gratitude for her small crop of potatoes and squash. It was Finn who saw it first. He was down by the creek, watching the geese forage in the twilight. When he came running back to the cabin, his face pale. Elspeth, you have to see. He led her not to her garden, but to the edge of her property, where it bordered the miller's cornfield. She carried a lantern. In its swaying light, the ground seemed to be moving. It was a carpet of gray and brown and black, a living, writhing mass of slugs. They were of all sizes, from tiny, glistening specks to thick, monstrous things as long as her finger. They were flowing out of the woods, out of the damp ditches, a silent, slimy army, and they were heading straight for the corn. The next morning, a third of the miller's field was gone. The valley finally understood what it was facing. It was a plague. The unnatural, damp heat had created a perfect breeding ground, and the slug population had exploded into something from a nightmare. Panic set in. The farmers, who depended on their market gardens and cash crops, were facing total ruin. They tried everything. They set out pans of stale beer, which were filled with drowned slugs by the hundreds, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a cup. They laid down wood ash and crushed eggshells, but the sheer number of slugs simply slimed their way over the barriers. They tried poison bran mash, which killed thousands, but seemed to make no dent in the endless tide. Despair settled over Promise Creek, as thick and suffocating as the humid air. Men stood at their fence lines in the morning, looking at the overnight destruction, their faces gray with defeat. The sound of their livelihood being chewed away in the dark was a kind of psychological torture. Silas Blackwood, whose extensive, immaculate fields were his pride, was hit the hardest. He had more to lose than anyone. People saw him riding his property at all hours, his face a thundercloud. Yet, inside the ugly wire fence of Elspeth's folly, there was an island of green in a valley of ruin. Her garden was untouched. Her marshy pasture was thriving. The reason was her 92 loud, obnoxious, wonderful geese. They were slug-eating machines. From dawn until dusk, they patrolled her land, their heads down, their bills snipping and gobbling with methodical efficiency. Slugs, it turned out, were a delicacy to a goose. The flock grew fat and glossy on the endless protein. They were a feathered army, holding the line against the invasion. Elspeth watched them, a slow, dawning realization in her mind. Her worthless birds, her sentimental folly, were the only thing in the valley that was working. The first to come was Silas Blackwood. He rode up to her gate one afternoon, his horse sweating, his face a mask of strained cordiality. He did not get off his horse, a small act of dominance. "Elspeth," he began, "the valley is in trouble. A plague sent to test us all." She stood on her side of the fence, her hands resting on a fence post, and waited. "I've seen your flock," he continued. "Remarkable, really. Who would have thought?" He cleared his throat. "I have a business proposition. I want to rent your geese." She just looked at him. "Rent them?" "Yes. I'll pay you a handsome price. $20. You bring them to my fields. Let them eat their fill for a week. They'll save my corn crop." It sounded reasonable, but Elspeth had learned to listen to what Blackwood didn't say. She knew his greed. He would work the geese until they dropped, then return them, or claim some had been lost, or simply refuse to give them back. He was a man who saw every crisis as an opportunity for himself. "They're not for rent, Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly. His smile tightened. "Don't be foolish, woman. That's more than those birds are worth. I'm doing you a favor. A young woman alone can't manage a flock that size. How many are there now?" 90. 91. The question was casual, but it was a mistake. Elspeth had never told anyone the exact count. Only she and Finn knew the number was 92. But Blackwood's men had likely been watching her, counting, assessing her assets for their boss. He knew her strength and was trying to turn it into his profit. "They stay here," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Rage flashed in his eyes, hot and ugly. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "When this is over, you'll come begging to me for seed. And I'll remember this day." He wrenched his horse's head around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust. That evening, as twilight bled across the sky, they came. Not one man on a fine horse, but a small, shuffling delegation of them. Miller, Peterson, Davies. The same men who had laughed at her from the porch of the general store. They stood at her gate, their hats in their hands, their faces etched with exhaustion and shame. They couldn't meet her eyes. Miller, a big man with a voice accustomed to booming, spoke first, his words soft and halting. "Elspeth, Mrs. Gable, we came to ask for help." Peterson nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "We were wrong to mock you. We see that now. Those birds of yours, they're eating the slugs." Elspeth waited, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. This was the moment. She held all the power. The arithmetic was simple. She could name any price. She could demand cash up front, enough to pay her debts and secure her future. She could gouge them, just as Blackwood would have, and no one could blame her. She looked past them, at their fields, at the ragged rows of dying plants. She saw not just the ruin of a crop, but the ruin of families. She remembered Mr. Anselm's words. "A thing is worthless only if it cannot find its strength." The geese had found their strength. Now it was her turn. "They can't save what's already lost," she said, her voice practical, not unkind. "But they can protect what's left. Here's the deal. There will be no charge in money. Instead, I'll take a share. 1 basket of every tin that you harvest from the fields they save.